Hey everybody, welcome back. We're trying to revive our Open Source Cowboys podcast. I guess this is episode 4, but new series, so thought leadership. I'm joined today with one of the experts in the inner source, open source, Web3 field. Y'all may have seen her before. Silona Bonewald, the one and only. Why don't you give us a brief background on you, Silona?
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, I've been involved in open source since for over 20 years now. And then got started with inner source at the very beginning with Denise Cooper when she kind of brought it into being, where she had our first founders meeting with like 16 of us in a room. And then I ended up helping implement it at PayPal with her. And so that's been kind of my open source journey. I kind of got into open source because of my scientific data background. And I was first caring a lot about actual data and data structures and was heavily involved in the internet and gaming. And so with open source, I was like, this is how we need to do these things fairly and creating them in such a way so that they couldn't be corrupted. I saw a lot of the methodologies that we use in open source to be similar to what we use in science. And so I wanted to, I think that's why I was just naturally attracted to it, was because of that. I wanted things like citability and all of that kind of aspect. And you couldn't do that if you had everything locked away in a little black box.
Yeah, and I think that's why open source brings so many people together, because it's as transparent as you could be. And if you slap a layer, Web3 layer on top of it, even more so.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
open source has birthed so many cool tools, because of the fact of trying to figure out how to be open in our collaboration. That's how we got, Git and the versioning systems. That's how we've all these different things that we've been creating out of that. And I feel like Web3 is, the next generation of that. So that's why I'm a big fan.
Absolutely. We'll leave that teaser there for later for this discussion. But you did mention inner source helping with PayPal. Can you delve more into the journey and what the mission of inner source was?
Sure, sure. Well, what we were trying to do is, so Denise got hired at PayPal and they wanted her to do open source. And then she realized, oh, there's too many laws and regulations as to why they can't actually be open source because they do financial management software. And in fact, like sometimes when payments get rejected, they can't tell you why the payments get rejected in banking because that would, tell the criminals what's going on too. And so there's a bunch of different weird rules and things that you have to do in regards to risk and fraud and things of that nature. So the code could never be completely open source. And so it was like, well, what can we do? What could be a stepping stone into that direction? And so that's when evidently Tim O'Reilly had coined the term quite some time ago, but no one had really been doing it much in practice. And so Denise, revived the term. And that's what we started doing at PayPal. And like one of the first steps that happened before I got there was getting them all over onto GitHub instead of being on a very old versioning system. And then they did one trial, which worked out well, but then it didn't stick. And that's when Denise hired me to come in. And so we talked about, and we did another trial with payments where we refactored payment core. And we're able to do that in less than a year with 5 different vice presidents to actually break out the payment core correctly and do all that kind of refactorization. And it became a huge hit, almost too big of a hit, actually, where everybody just started saying, because the CEO was so pleased, everyone's like, let's inner source this, let's inner source that, let's inner source, let's inner source. It was like a vocabulary issue at that point, because instead of saying collaborate, they started saying inner source. And so we had to quickly write down what is inner source, because it wasn't just collaboration. There are rules. And so we took a lot of the different rules from the fact that we've done so many open source projects and created them and sat there and go, oh, well, you need to have somebody like a trusted committer. You need to have, you had all these different roles and responsibilities and tactics and techniques that open source had kind of originated, but hadn't always codified out yet. There were a few books that kind of talked about it, but not a lot. And so that's what we started doing with inner sourcing, is kind of codifying all of that for the enterprise level, so that all 22,000 PayPal employees could collaborate worldwide and see what each other were doing. And then I started doing tooling to help support that, where I took over the orchestration tooling, which had only been adopted by about 2,000 of the 5,000 developers. But then after we redid it, made it API centric, added in CI/CD and database as a service and a bunch of other features, then we got complete adoption. almost too much of a complete adoption because I didn't put a restraint on the CI/CD at the very beginning, and we got into $20 million Google Cloud bill, and had to go back in there and fix that.
That definitely makes a knock on the door.
But one of the other things that we did is we did enterprise search. And from that, we were able to sit there and see that we had 12 different currency tools. And we were able to figure out who was working on them where and get some cohesion. Because if you can imagine what the bug tracking is looking like for that,
I can imagine.
it's a bit heinous. So, that's what we ended up doing with it. And I also created a training program and a certification program. And so I was able to train up over 1,300 people in PayPal on what InnerSource was and what it wasn't and how to do the different processes. And the majority of those people were actually managers because the developers already understood open source.
Yeah.
But the managers didn't always understand how to manage that well and how to cross-pollinate across all the different groups and also how to do reporting and metrics on it. And so that ended up being, I think, the big thing that flipped it all the way over is making sure that middle management was able to adopt it as well. And then it kind of went past me.
Well, I know InnerSource, it's now become like InnerSource Commons. It's become a big adoption piece for the same use cases and expanded. But for that pioneering vision, what would you say the biggest hurdle was? Was it the culture shift, the tooling, consolidating things into more collaborative, streamlined paths, or?
So the tooling wasn't as big of a thing as you would have thought it might be because of so many developers already wanting to work in Git and not liking working in ClearCase and these weird proprietary tools and all that kind of stuff. So the tooling wasn't as big of a deal. The main thing that ended up being a problem, I think, was the collaboration across the different groups and the measurement of that so that it could still be rewarded. Because so often, and thankfully PayPal doesn't do this like Microsoft does, but too often they pitch silos against each other. And this was like, no, we're removing all of the silos. And so thankfully, since we had CEO support, where he talked about the one team and everybody could measure the one team, a big lift of it, since I had that support, a very big lift was sitting there saying, here's how you measure it. Here's how you can report it as the managers could and the upper levels could. And so that way they actually knew what it is that they were doing and how much it was valuable to them. And so I think that was like one of the really big lifts to getting it because the developers always thought it was awesome, for the most part. There were a few people who, believed in job security through obscurity. But, the majority of nerds, they don't like working that way. And so they wanted to be able to collaborate better with each other. And so that was really helpful.
Yeah, well, there's always the finance person who doesn't want the tech innovation because they have job security keeping up to date in Excel spreadsheets. So
exactly,
I can definitely see that kind of gridlock there. I know I had the chance to work on one InnerSource change, and it kind of worked. But like you're saying, you had the product silos, so it became that performance thing of making sure you attained or kept your operational budget with additional KPIs, etc.
Right.
And then they ended up just not liking the term InnerSource because it was preached too much, so they just called it better open source, and the mission still changed. So it's all the same thing.
It's all good. Not invented here syndrome is real. It's whatever. That was one reason I think that Denise used InnerSource is because she didn't invent it. She's like, Tim O'Reilly did. We're not going to deal with this not invented here syndrome.
Yeah.
We're going to,
pick and choose your battles.
Exactly.
Well, I know from there you also started getting your experience into early government / the Web3 space with the Hyperledger. Can you tell me about that transition change a little bit?
Sure. Well, the funny thing is, I've been on the periphery of blockchain for quite some time. In fact, I did my own DLT back in 2004 with the Transparent Federal Budget Project with Jimmy Wales and Bill Bradley, which was Mercurial, which is a versioning system, and Merkle trees. So it was basically a way of doing a distributed ledger. And so when Bitcoin came out, I was like, I really want to like this, but I do not like the energy usage, and I kept asking why we couldn't do something like a proof of stake, that Charles championed. And everyone told me, oh, you just don't know what you're talking about, lady. And I'm just kind of like, okay, whatever. I've only been doing database longer than you people, but fine. And so I kind of, kept it a little bit at length, even though I liked the idea of it, and still kind of tinkered with my ideas. And Hyperledger ends up being one of those, right? Because it's not the whole cryptocurrency thing, it's a permissioned blockchain. And so you have like this complete accountability, and really it's the way supply chains are going to have to go. Everyone sits there and says all of these other different things, but in the end, if you really want to be able to trust but verify across, an entire chain of custody for all of these different things, this is really the direction that the databases need to go. And I think nothing's shown that better than like what just happened with Elon Musk. I've always said admin is a single point of failure, when you look at these different ones. And that's been very true in the database world, and that's what I've been involved with for, over 30 years. And so it's like, we really need to get past this, and blockchain is it. And so that was my thing with Hyperledger, is I viewed that it is the way that we do have to move forward in regards to data and data storage. And when people sit there and say, oh, it's too slow, I can always say, go look at fast Hyperledger, fast Fabric, 20,000 transactions a second. So, squeeze me.
Yeah, well, even on the Cardano use case, because they did the test trial with a private instance of Hydra head being an L2, and they got up to, they ported Doom onto it, so they got up to 1 million transactions a second. But like, you can get there, even with the permissionless stake, you can still set up your permissioned environment, and I think that's definitely where you got to go with those systems. But with Hyperledger on the timeline, was it still a foundling project with the LF at that time when you joined, or was it already gaining traction? Would you say
it was gaining traction? It was already, it had already been implemented a fair amount of places at that point.
Gotcha.
So it had been donated a few years before from IBM, and I think John Wolpert was the guy who did that. I'm not sure, but yeah, it had already been there, and we already had several different types that were there. The key element about all of them was, the permission chained aspect of it when I first came in. And one of the things that we did change on that is adding more stuff. Because at first it was like, oh, we only have these key projects. And I was like, yeah, but you need, a way for things to ramp up. And so, my team had wanted to do labs, and you had been doing these different things with labs. And so we actually just like codified what that was by meeting a lot with the technical steering committee and going through what that all looked like, and creating an actual process, and then also having a validation process for everything, and adding in things like CI/CD and doing all those other different things to make sure that everything
professional methods, essentially.
Yeah, it was basically assuring that all of the different, that everybody understood what level those code bases were at. It's like, okay, is this one ready to rock and roll? Is it not? What's some of the other pieces that need to happen in regards to it? So it was a little bit more of that, because we were doing so many different trial rollouts with so many large corporations that it was like, we really need to make sure that this stuff is like nailed down, and it won't do anything to hurt LF's reputation. So we did a lot of that.
I see. Well, and that puts you in touch with, because I know Cardano has a more like individualistic community. There's some companies and big players here and there, but Hyperledger has more of that bigger client base that they have to integrate with. How would you say their approach to blockchain is, outside of just being permissioned friendly?
Well, I think for a lot of their stuff, it is, as you said, it is about the corporate. There are some volunteers that are individualistic, but there's not a huge amount. So one of the things that we kind of worked on more is actually making sure that all of those companies could work together with each other. So licensing was licensing is really important. Code checks are very important. Doing all these other different
liability loopholes. I mean, hoops you go through.
Yeah, well, it was one of those things where like I did, like I helped out on export control. where, they were like, one company had done too much of the code base and didn't have any external contributions. And I'm like, that's going to become a problem during export control. So then I recruited a bunch of other places to go over there and do some changes on it and to work with them more. And I also changed up the tools so that they could, because we had a big problem with not being very available to the APAC region. And so by incorporating a lot of the more collaborative tools, I made it friendlier to the APAC region, like doing, it's not open source, but by using Confluence, I was able to have all of the website completely translated, because it was easy to add that packet in. So the entire wiki got translated and all the documentation got translated by different Chinese companies. By adding in the fact that people could use whatever chat that they wanted, but the chat still had to sync up with Rocket Chat so that everybody could at least see what was going on. Helped a lot with different integrations across timelines, because one of the problems we had when I first got there is people thought that China wasn't doing much. I was like, oh, they're doing a lot in APAC.
Yeah.
I'm like,
just because you're not up at the same time.
Just because you're not up at the same time, they're not coming to your meetings doesn't mean that they're not doing stuff. I said, we need to pull these different things in so that we can showcase that a bit more. And that helped a lot too with their membership, in that you had a lot more APAC join after that, because they were like, oh, well, you are open to our companies, you are open to working on this, we'll put in the money and effort to join, because joining Hyperledger is not cheap.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't then.
Well, I think we only got a deal because we were a good nonprofit. So we were able to talk our way in a little bit. But yeah.
No, that's true for nonprofits. It's not true for businesses.
Yeah.
So, And it makes sense too, because Hyperledger, especially at the time, we were putting a significant amount of money into those projects, right? Not just marketing and events, but also code validation and all of those other different things. So it was like you were getting this seal of approval, and also doing the certifications, because we did all those too. And so you knew that when you got things, it was at a certain level, which was important for corporate.
Well, leading into that, and kind of like the necessary take for open source nonprofits, why would you say they're a critical factor in building open source projects, build trust, community building, etc.?
So, and there's different kinds of open source nonprofits out there, right? Because you've got like the Linux Foundation, and the Linux Foundation is very good about corporate. They're very good at bringing in a lot of money, doing the different things, doing the different certifications, all that kind of stuff. But, there's a lot of people very unhappy with them on the individualistic side. So you end up seeing a lot of little smaller nonprofits go and get created because they don't want their governance or, things being dominated by profit. And so you end up watching different groups get created for different reasons in regards to that. And then, I've watched a lot of those actually occur in government, because Linux Foundation is seen as too dominated by American corporations. And American corporations haven't been playing well lately with others. And so that ends up causing problems as well, especially on the whole data side of it, because Europe no longer trusts America in regards to data, especially with our current administration. So they're like, no, you can't have our data. And there's been a bunch of rules that have been passed in the past year from different states and countries in the EU, where government and children and schools are not allowed to use services that keep their data in the United States or forwarding data to the United States.
I can see that. Well, and then I think the open source initiative, when it's supposed to be the steward of approved licenses, got into a tiff lately about their election cycle, on whether they're becoming too much paid staff when it was a volunteer type thing. So
yeah. And that's been like the whole thing with Apache, right? Is Apache has purposely never really had any staff. But at the same time, it's a hard decision as to whether or not to go to put your project in Apache. Because first of all, they have a pretty, if you haven't been following the Apache way all the way through, you could possibly kill your open source project transitioning over there, because you won't have enough resources to make that transition. And at the same time, you're not going to get that same kind of marketing and all those other that the Linux Foundation puts into things. And so I see that push and pull happening between Apache and the Linux Foundation all of the time.
Yeah. Well, and even with the diversity for it, so bringing it into like the Cardano example, which is
Yeah.
the whole business use case of what was the DCF, then Constellation, then Intersect, I guess, is the next stage for it, or Voltaire. But you had the core source code. We originally tried to partner with Linux. It didn't end up working out due to whatever their various politics was, and then they set up their own MBO. Would you say that they did the right step in setting up Intersect altogether? Or like
I think
the idea of it, I guess?
I think the idea of it is very important. I don't think that Cardano would have fit into the Linux Foundation model. It just doesn't, in regards to how they manage revenue, how they do the money, how they do the voting, how they have all their governance together. They are different models. And the Linux Foundation, in many ways, is not interested in changing those models, right? You know, it's like, how do you become on the board of directors for Hyperledger? You buy it. You know, it's like, you give a huge amount of money and you're on the board of directors, and they only have so many slots. There's like, I think 2 positions. I don't know how many still, but there were 2 positions that were elected so that other people could still see things that were going on and stuff. But really, it's still, when the collective voted, it was voting with pocketbooks. And I understand that. Like, I understand that from a business perspective. Like, you're sitting there going, well, I'm going to give you a huge amount of money. I want to know how it's spent. I want to know this. I want to know that. I want to know that. But it's not the same as a lot of the other Web3 models, right? The Web3 models are trying to figure out, how do we give power to individuals? How do we work with, you know, all of these different, you know, groups and things of that nature? And not to mention, honestly, you know, and you've heard me say this many times, governance is cultural.
Yeah.
And the Linux Foundation has a corporate culture governance, and that's the reality of it. And Cardano is not.
Yeah.
So I've never thought that Cardano would have fit in regards to that model, because of how, you know, you want to have so much with all of these different groups, and you want to diagram it out, and you want to know all the different people. Do you know what I mean? Like, even like us talking about all the ecosystem mapping that we want to do and all these different things, like, we care so much about all these little things that are going on and trying to figure out what we can fund and what we can help raise, that's a very different mentality.
Yeah. Well, and it goes to if you, I don't know if you've seen Bitergia's new radar report, where like Hedera, because of their council and their big corporate players, it makes sense to go to the LF because they already have cross collaboration there, and their model kind of fits into the LFDT, etc. But Bitergia did a radar report. I'll share it with you if you haven't seen it already, where it examines all the different cross-pollinations between ecosystems. And Hedera and Cardano are like the 2 outliers that have a lot more in common than other ecosystems, because there's a lot more like that fine-tuning of how you want to run your governance and give power to the individual. And plus, Cardano has its own community culture, I would say. That would be a big hurdle to get over to, tying into the LF folks, which we're already trying to do anyway. So it's a funny, fun roller coaster
for you. You know, and I'm not saying that it can't happen, right? I mean, like,
it's just,
when we brought in the labs to Hyperledger, that was like one of the things to do that. Is sit there and go, no, these smaller projects can come in, and it doesn't need to be this huge amount of money. And there's all these and there are groups that are that you can go and do that. But I think just overall, it's a different structure, and it has a very different feel. And and so you end up seeing a lot of different people who get very upset with that structure, especially if they're volunteering a lot.
Well, and it's I think the best use case for Cardano integrating was the Atalum Prism transfer. You now have Identis identity solution provisions, and the teams are working well on that side. So we do have an open door that way, and then my involvement, etc. But
I think it's great for things like that where you want to get standardized, right? And you're trying to do a small S standard, not a big S standard yet. You know, and that was like one reason why I recommended that they split Hyperledger Aries off of Indy, is so that we could kind of get like this pseudo programmatic, you know, real life standard done on DIDs and identity. And so when y'all were talking about doing that, I was like, yes, please, you know, go in there and do that, because it becomes a good working example of these things and how they work. And if you plug it in and you sit there and show all that interoperability, then you start to create this de facto small S standard before, you know, having to go through, you know, some of the big S standards in regards to standardization bodies like IEEE and WC3 and IETF.
Well, even on this is my honest confession. Even when trying to do standardization for how you do project maturity ratings, the
Hmm.
acceptance criteria, etc., I have had to tailor everything from the corporate standards to Cardano, so we have a more fair assessment of stuff because there's a different vibe to our projects altogether.
Definitely, definitely, and it should be. I
Yeah,
mean, it is a different vibe. It is a different culture. It is the people are very different in
yeah.
regards to that.
Well,
So,
and with that, I know you got to help me personally with the structure of Intersect's open source step process and stuff. You helped me ideate and create the paid open source model.
mhm.
Um, what would you say is it a good thing for us to be progressing with? Are there things you think we should add to it? Just your overall opinion on where we've gone so far with that.
I think it's great because normally people get paid in one of two ways, right? It's either you're working for a company and you're doing it and that's how you're getting paid, or you've got some completely random sponsorship model where it's feast or famine and you never know when things are coming through and you never know how things are going to happen and it's very difficult. And so having something that can be more reliable, where the developers can free up their brains to just work and not have to be constantly, hustling, I think is crucial. And so, and not only that, but having a system where they can show it off too, I think is really important. One of the main ways that I've seen that people get their jobs in open source for those sustainable, groups is like for Drupal, one of the big things is, oh, I've become a core maintainer. And then you can go to any of the other development houses and immediately get a job because that's what they advertise. Oh, we have a core maintainer on our staff. So not only do we use this open source project fundamentally, but we have, some of our staff are core maintainers, and it shows a certain level of, understanding and quality. And so going through and doing this, you're going to hopefully create that within your ecosystem. And so they're going, oh, these are the people who are doing these things. This is how they're doing it. This is how we can measure the quality, which can help with other funding models as well, not just the open source funding model.
I agree. Well, and I think that's where you had course corrected me to tying these different programs specifically to the software development lifecycle pieces. So that way
Yes.
it's easy to track implementation and where the OKR should tie in and at which steps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I've
Yeah.
seen we don't want to have any bad metrics.
Yeah.
We want to try to
GitHub
go into
stars
a
aren't
real
reliable, you're saying?
No. I'm like, yeah, I've gotten in trouble on that one more than once, where I sit there and I'm just like, please don't quote your stars to me. I have no interest. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to look. I'm going to see how many developers you actually have working. I'm going to see how much they're actually working.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, look at those other ones. But of course, you have Liturgia, so you've got, the crown princes of that working on there. So you're good to go in regards to that.
Yeah.
And I'm
Shout
great
out
that
to
they're helping
your
with those metrics. Yes, yes.
I've abused him more than he's volunteered to for. Um, but what would you say? How can I guess us with this coming implementation? Because I think the government action actually goes live this either today or next week. I think
Mhm.
it's next week. The governance action to finally get approved. We already got 85% on the DREP approval for the info action, so now we got to implement it. Um,
Mhm.
is there any tweaks you would suggest for us or KPIs to track, lessons learned to measure so we can, because we have the thesis, right? Now we're going into
Mhm.
implementation for the 6 months. What should we be doing for next steps to make sure we can scale the program and or retract it?
Well, I think the biggest thing on there is going to be getting in there and doing the metrics that I recommend are the ones I think you're already doing for the most part, which are the ones from Liturgia, which is basically sitting there going, what is the coding looking like? What is implementations looking like? What, how is the adoption going in regards to that? All of those different things I think are what's crucial for knowing what's actually going on. Because the problem is like with GitHub, you can't just go and look at a project, go, oh, it's great.
Yeah.
You actually have to go in there and look at the code and look at the people and sit there and see how much they're actually contributing and how often they're contributing and how much they're contributing. And then you also have to go out and look at the product itself and go, are people using it?
Yeah.
That's like a big one that a lot of people forget is, are people actually using this? And so you do have to go through and get all those together. And so by going through and doing the whole software development lifecycle, I think that's going to get you closer than anything else will. And I think, it's one of those things where, with how I always view these kinds of monitoring situations is at the very beginning, I create way too many dashboards. And then I figure out which dashboards work and which ones don't. And so I think what you're doing is good because you're going to go and get way too much data. And then you're going to go, yeah, okay, this is what actually matters. And this is why, and then hopefully, and if you do trim, anybody who is an outlier will let you know, just do a little shout test.
Yeah.
And they'll tell you, don't give it down, Patrick, that's my key one.
That's what I thought about with the project maturity stuff. We just did our first draft, and a lot of it was automated. So I'm just going to be like, here's what I think your grade is. Here's the output. Please tell me what's wrong so we can update it. So
Exactly. The shout test is I think the best possible way because, it's a funny thing with people because if you sit there and you just give it to them, they're all going to go, and they won't actually read it or look at it. But then when you give them the thing that's like their report on them, then they'll be like, oh,
yeah. It's the difference of the teacher telling you you're failing in class versus your parents saying the report card. So.
Exactly. You have to have that. And then suddenly everyone goes, and they freak out and they give you lots of very, very detailed feedback, especially if it's nerds, right? You'll get very detailed feedback about why these metrics and how you should be measuring these metrics and all of that after you give them a report on them.
100%. Well, and with this, because we did try to pioneer this as the first take on how you can responsibly address open source sustainability in Web3 spaces. How would you say our approach is comparing to Web2 or other spaces? Minus the fact that we have a digital nation and this is done via that governance model, because that's its own animal.
I don't think there's much being done in the other ones, honestly. I think this is new. I think the only thing that would be kind of close is what businesses try to do, right? Which is why I pointed you towards the SDLC is because oh, well, this is how we measure things at PayPal. Okay, this is how we measure, and so I feel like there hasn't been that kind of measurement in open source, which has been, one reason why I think sometimes people love volunteering is because then they can go and do whatever they want and they don't have to worry about KPIs or OKRs, right? But at the same time, we have to get something going to try and figure out how to do the sustainability and how to do some kind of ongoing funding. And I don't know of any other group that has enough budget to do this correctly, honestly, other than, Cardano and the other Web3 crypto worlds that actually have these treasuries where they can go and try and experiment and try the different things out. And so that's why I think it's kind of beautiful to sit there and watch them doing that. Because I'm involved with some other Web3 stuff right now where they're doing DAOs and for nonprofits and things of that nature where, you can sit there and do the smart contracts and do the donations because it's like microfinance, for example. What was the big Kiva controversy? Well, guess what? They were lying. and it wasn't one of those things where they were lying horribly, right? It was just kind of dude, do you know how hard it is to track all this crap? It's hard. And so instead, if you go and you create a system like what Cardano has with the whole Web3 space where it's on a blockchain, you watch all the stuff, you do all the stuff, you add in the smart contracts, you have all the voting, you have each of these different pieces and protocols in there for a DAO, there's no longer any question as to what happened here and how did it get distributed. You can sit there and see it. And if you make, and I feel like if you make people aware of that, then, it's just kind of like the whole stealing thing where the majority of people won't steal when they're being watched.
Yep.
You still have some that will, okay, we can't do anything about that. But we can do we can't get out the majority of people who typically want, we can get that 80% who want to be good. Kind of thing.
It's like the biggest theft in history was in crypto, but the most money ever recovered was also the same theft because everything's traceable. And it just so helped that the guy had all his passwords in a Google sheet.
Yeah, totally. Totally. It's, that's the way it has to, that's the thing that I think is beautiful about it. And I think that's always been one of the problems behind, I think microfinance is a really great way of helping people because then you only lose little bitty bits of money if someone is fraudulent, and you can find it fairly quickly if you do have all the traceability. And so if we do something with, doing DAOs and all that, we'll have that complete traceability, and it'll become really apparent. Like, Joe Bob, he's always asking for money to, do blah, blah, but he never does it. And it will become very obvious that Joe Bob isn't a great person to fund, but while I did it, I only lost $1,500 or something silly like that.
Yeah. Typically the giveaway is 2 first names, but
well, I'm from Texas, so I can't say anything.
Well, half my relatives are from West Virginia, and then the other half are Texas, so I will gladly make that joke. Some have teeth, some have no teeth.
Exactly. We get to make those jokes.
Well, with that too, because your other role was you were the executive director at IEEE. You've dealt with the governance and the Linux Foundation. You've seen Cardano intersect, how we modeled stuff, help this get that on ramp. And you've also been a part of early government with the DLT. So there's a big culture shift, and this is where a lot of maxis get back and forth, especially if you're trying to drive Web 2 and Web 3 communities together. Speaking from personal experience here, how would you say where the balance is between the decentralized aspects and needing structure and accountability? And how do you kind of mingle that together without not necessarily saying you have to compromise, but
yeah. No, I think and I think it's very possible to do localization, right? Where and we can do codified localization, where you can start off with like really basic rules at the top, bring them all the way down until you have where you allow people to get more and more complex, so that they can actually, because as I keep saying, governance is cultural. And so if you can sit there and have methodologies where each of those different groups can represent themselves, and have the localization aspects of it that still come up to a centralization point, you can have that kind of freedom and scale. And so that's what I think is really important. I think everyone I think agrees on a lot of basics, right? Like everybody agrees that, certain things should be written down. Everybody agrees that certain things should be recorded. There's a lot of very basic things that humanity, I think, normally does agree upon. And I have to admit, I have that complete bias because of science. It's like all these scientists, we all agree on the scientific method. Do all the publishers all do the same type of peer review? No. Do all have these? No. But they all do these similar things in somewhat similar ways, just with different implementations that fit them better culturally. And of course, whatever tools they're using. So I feel like that's something that we can really get into with the Web3 stuff, even with the cultural differences between Web 2 and Web 3. Because I feel like there's a lot of people, because there's also, Web 3.0, right?
Yeah.
Which has kind of gone by the wayside, but it was before we had all the blockchain and all those other different aspects of the decentralization. And so when I saw, because of my distrusting nature and doing my own DLT in 2004, I immediately saw the value in doing, the Web3 portions with having that all codified. Of course, I also saw the risks in regards to privacy and all those different aspects. And so, but I think that there are ways of doing that. Just like when I had my discussions with the military, when I was working for Hyperledger, I spoke at a military think tank on blockchain. And of course, they're not going to be putting all the military stuff on Cardano. Sorry, not happening. Yeah. But there are places where intersections could possibly happen, right? Yeah. Because like one of the things that I was stressing to them about different aspects of it is, one of the things we had done with Hyperledger Indy was they had abstracted out URSA, which was the actual cryptography, which I said, you need to do because hello, quantum. We need to like look at these, if you don't
get ahead of it.
Well, there's a reason for modularization and compartmentalization for these different things, so that you can, when one circuit that doesn't work for you anymore, you can yank it out and put the other one in. Now, sometimes you have to compromise for size or space or whatever, but that's where you need to start from. And so I think that's really important. And so And I think that's one of the things that Web3 can give to Web2 that they didn't have before. Because, you know, when the internet and the web was created, they weren't thinking in these directions. In fact, in 92, when DNS came out and I wanted to register all the categories of the Yellow Pages, I was told, no, you can't do that. You're going to try to commercialize the internet.
Oh, like that didn't happen.
To which I'm like, of course it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But, you know, that was just like, but that was like the ethos at the beginning, right? Was, you know, no, that's not what this is for. But, you know, eventually it is, you know, partially what it's going to be for. So what are the ways that you can safeguard yourself in regards to that? And so that's why I think Web3 is important, because you can create different ones to safeguard yourself from predatory capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, that was like the big dream behind a lot of the people with Bitcoin, was basically not to be restricted in regards to being able to trade with others. So I've worked on a lot of stuff with reputational currency and blah, 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 and none of it's perfect, but we have to keep trying.
I summed up my experience so far, because I'm a pretty adaptable person to the different communities I work with, but it's kind of like a gym. Everybody has a specific workout routine, and if you try to course correct anybody, they treat it as though you're trying to convert them from their religion or something. Everyone's very adverse about their ways of working out and how comfortable they are with themselves and what they want to work on, etc. But the thing you have to agree to is the same gym that you're going to, and there's different flavors of gyms. So just build your institution and then figure out your workout routines inside the gym house.
Totally. And hey, maybe you want to go work out outside.
Yeah, there's always the option. Enter Cardano. Just kidding.
Want to go roll tires? I'm gonna go do that one.
Well, and so with that, I know the big thing coming up, especially with governance, is the effects of AI. And I just happen to know that's one of your pet subjects that you've been studying on lately. So what would you say what trends are you watching closely, things we should be looking out for when it comes to AI implementations, risks, things we should like go after, stuff like that? Kind of open-ended.
Well, one of the things that I've been talking about a lot is citable AI. You know, because I'm a one-trick pony, and you know, and I believe in citability, and so I believe that in citable AI, this is how we can actually address some of those issues. And so there's examples of people that are basically doing that already on Hugging Face, right? There's people where you can build your own AI, and so you don't have to do that. And so then people know that this is, you know, the Silona AI that she built, and therefore the stuff coming out of that, you know, Silona feels like she owns. There's also different things that you can do with knowledge graphs and knowledge bases. And I really do feel that like going through there and doing that and connecting it all, blockchain is going to be a crucial portion of that. And I do think that figuring out how to pay people for it, crypto is a really good solution in regards to it, because, you know, that's what we were trying, you know, the very first time I heard about NFTs, before all the monkey business, was I thought, oh my God, this would be amazing for land deeds in Africa. Because I'd just been discussing with a friend about how the warlords, one of the first things they do is burn all the records. So that people don't own property. And like one of the biggest reasons I think that America has been so wealthy is because of the fact that property helped create a middle class. And so therefore there was a lot of spending power, and there was all these different things.
Yeah.
And so I feel
power was tied to you having land and everything.
Exactly. And so I felt that that was like a big communal thing that happened, and that, you know, Africa needs something like that so that people can have something to own and exchange. And be able to have banking against it and do the different values and all that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, we have to go in similar ways in regards to our data, where we can go in and use these different things. Because, you know, one of the things that I think that people misunderstand about blockchain is they think that all of the data has to be transparent. And it's like, hell no, it does not. In fact, I do not recommend putting data on the blockchain. It's like, no, transactions go on the blockchain. The data itself does not go on the blockchain. It's like, you want to know how you get a slow blockchain? That's how you get a slow blockchain.
Well,
So
that's why
I feel,
scammers prefer to be paid in.
but so if you can sit there and do that where the data then becomes more accountable, more traceable, you can sit there and see whose it is and where it's going and things of that nature. I think that's going to become an important aspect for the new AIs that start to come out. And you'll sit there and see that sort of happening already, where like businesses are going through and like creating a business specific AI. And what they're doing with that is they're ending up, once again, using those knowledge graphs on top of those other genericized models. And I feel like that's where things are going to have to go. The question is what the quality is going to be on certain things. Because one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of the generative AIs is whenever I get anything really good, I'll go do a reverse search. And I'll figure out where it actually came from. Because like, I don't know how many times I've seen a really great image. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And then I'm like, somewhere in my art history background goes, wait a second. And then I go look it up, and sure enough, it's like 80% something classic, and then like 20% Simpsons. I don't know, but it's like it does a lot of that, and I think we are going to have to like address what that means in regards to ownership and copyright and payment. And I think that's the thing that everybody forgets about is like I ended up having a meeting with I think it's the Copyright Clearance Collective. It's like an internationalization of all the different copyright organizations around the world. And they were like, we would be fine with AI if it was a citable AI, where we knew what artist things came from and we knew what the percentages were and we knew all those different aspects. And and you can do that. It's just that people don't like admitting that you can do that. But there's going to be more and more examples out there showing that yes, it can be done.
Very relevant thing. So I'm a big gaming person. I follow gaming news like crazy because ironically, that's what got me into open source. If anyone ever goes to Elder Scrolls or modding, there's a whole creation engine. Yes, it's still pay for free, but everyone mods for free for everybody. And now they're starting to get into that, but people still want the free stuff because the community demands it. But there's a mistake by one of my favorite game developers, Bungie, who got bought out by Microsoft for the Halo franchise. They spun off to do their own thing. They were releasing Marathon, which is re-releasing, which is their old IP before Halo. And they had this whole unique art, texture, game sets, stuff like that. And then right before they were about to do their tech demo for their live beta, someone found out, oh, hey, you remember that AI or whatever program we used to get it? It looks like all our 95% of our artwork is copyrighted. So they did a tech demo with no tech. They're just sitting there embarrassed because they can't display any of it because it was all copyrighted. So I think Bungie's going to close doors, but a good reason to have some citable AI.
Yes, most definitely. Well, and that's the whole thing. It's why did we create copyright?
Yeah.
It's like why did we create? Originally, why did we create it? Well, it was to protect artists and writers and people to be compensated for the work that they've done, and that's why a key element of copyright has always been that human element of going in there and doing that. And I think that AI is being false when it sits there and says, "Oh, we don't need to worry about that." I'm like, yes, you do, because you've stolen from everyone.
Yeah.
In regards to that. And I do think that will start to suss out at some point. I don't know what it's going to look like, but the law is going to have to change on that. Because, one of the things that on all of this that I constantly think about is incentivization and sustainability. And if you don't have those aspects in there, then things can't be sustainable. And I think that's what's so important about your paid model, right? Is you want those developers to be sustainable. You want them to be able to do all this work and get all these things done. You don't want them, having to go work at a gas station. You want them to be coding.
100%.
You want your artists to be arting. You have to figure out how to do the incentivization for these people so that they can continue to do what they want to do for us naturally.
Well, and that's where I think Cardano, the biggest thing was just having those steps people can take to be involved. They're already passionate for it, for the ethos. Now I'll give them incentives for them to stay, and it's going to be its own growing ecosystem. I think because of the treasure, we're lucky that we can give ourselves an adrenaline shot of open source culture and get going. So. Yeah. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get 100 community maintainers on 50 projects. It's still
Yeah, totally.
dreaming, but I think we can get 70, 80% by the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
But with that, since we're coming up close, one final question for you, or two questions. First one being, if someone is new getting into this whole digital space, open source, blockchain governance, how would you recommend their first steps be? Or what should they be getting into now?
Okay, so those are three different things.
Attack them as you want.
Yes. So for open source itself, find an event, go to an event. Also, remember, everything's online. So you can go and just snoop. I would just go and snoop on your projects you like or things of that nature, and just go around and poke around and sit there and see what's going on. Join some Discords, get on Reddit, get on Slashdot, get on any of those different ones, and just like watch for a while, and then decide what it is that your heart really goes out to or has some kind of meaning, and then I would go to those things, and then I would engage. Governance. Governance is a whole other thing. I feel like governance isn't safe until you've been like doing open source for a while. But I think it's crucial. That's when I keep talking about we need to get more open source people involved in standards, because while in a way it's antithetical, how standards are done, it's often antithetical to how people are used to working in open source, because with open source, there's just so much freedom. And then you get into standards and it's like, honestly, it's like torture for everybody on the spectrum, because you all have to sit there and like be social and argue over all of these different things and do all that. And it's really hard to do. But I do think it's really important to at least participate in like the use case portion, because a standard is only as good as all of its use cases. I love the XKCD, cartoon about standards, where it's like there were 13 standards. They're like, well, we need one that actually, can encompasses all. Then it's like, now there are 14 standards. That's the reality, is that you need to be involved right at the beginning, because the more use cases you get in there, the better off it's going to be for you, as well as for everybody else. And so, unlike what some people say, diversity is key if you want to do a good standard. And because some of the bad standards are when it's just like one corporation that comes in and does it. And so it's like better if you have multiple corporations. Okay, that's fine. But what's even better is if you have some corporations and some nonprofits and then some individuals, and then you're actually going to start. Yeah. And then if you have global diversity, then you'll actually get to where you create a standard for real that everybody actually wants and uses. So that's what I have to say on that in regards to governance, is to get involved with some of the standards that are happening on that, because there's a lot of new stuff that's coming through in the Web3 world that's really cool and exciting, but they could use some actual old school poli-sci people and maybe some mathematicians on decision theory. So some of the gamers need to go and get involved in that, I think.
100%. It needs a little bit from everybody.
Yeah. I keep talking about how I want to do some kind of game in regards to it, where we could have the different voting games, and you could sit there and see, what all those different structures are for all the different kinds of voting, and what happens when you do the different ones. And
you can jump in Web3 and Pioneer and do all this kind of stuff, but if you forget the geopolitical regulation side of it, you can get in trouble pretty fast.
Well, that's why you had me at a lot of those meetings, right? Oh, this isn't going to be legal. Neither is this one over here. Oh, legal issue here. I was kind of a joy kill, but
well, and
you have to remember that.
If you could wave a magic wand and fix one thing in open source culture or ecosystems, what would it be? Is that too generic?
Well, there's two things. So the money is the obvious one, but I don't want to talk about the money one. But, you're experimenting. You're going to solve that for me, Christian. We'll be fine. No, I want to talk about the collaboration, and that I feel like we need more stuff to help us do longer term and continual collaboration, because I watch so many projects just spawn up and they're beautiful for a little while and then they die and die. And how do we not waste all of that? how do we get better cross collaboration? How do we sit there and say, hey, you're doing this cool thing over here, but I also did this cool thing over here. And then if you take this cool thing over here, then we could really have this really amazing thing. And I would like to solve more of that collaboration issue, because I feel like there's way too much of not invented here syndrome, or reinventing the wheel, or and I think sometimes it is problematic with what we do in our metrics and measurement, where the ownership part becomes too big of a deal, and so if there are ways that we can get past that, would be great. But yeah, I just want to be able to like find and hang out with my people more.
I'm with you on there. Like making sure you're getting paid, but if you're alone in a room getting paid, it's not really fun. It's like, I don't care what kind of native coins are in someone's wallet, as long as everybody is succeeding together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I better stop talking before I make somebody mad in the comments.
Oh, I'm sure I already have. I always do. I think that's why people invite me. It's because I'll go invent some controversy again.
I'll go take this, make some short hot takes. I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
But yeah, thank you for joining. I know this has been a great topic covering various many things. I know I'll continue to see you, but I always appreciate your wisdom, helping me get started from the ground up. You always be one of my mentors that I look up to.
Thank you, Christian. I adore you too.
But thank you for your time.
People.